Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, fellow students. A very good afternoon for all of you. Before we start, we will begin by singing our national anthem.
Lagu Indonesia ya.
Thank you. On behalf of the Environmental Sciences Program, Postgraduate Faculty of the University of Indonesia, I am pleased to welcome all of you to attend this discussion. First, I would like to deliver today's agenda. We are scheduled to have Professor Emil Salim to speak, but he's on his way. So, first we would like to call the Secretary of the program, or Secretary of the Environmental Sciences Program, Dr. Sari Hasibuan, to open, to give a few words. Sari, please.
Your Excellency, Ambassador Douglas Broderick, United Nations Resident Coordinator, para dosen, Bapak Hasrul, Pak Ubi, dan mahasiswa di seluruh aktivitas akademika program studi ilmu lingkungan dan juga program pasca Universitas Indonesia yang saya cintai. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Your Excellency, it is a great pleasure to welcome you today. This much anticipated discussion. Please allow me to introduce briefly about our environmental science program. Environmental science program was established in 1982, so really a long history, and in response to the need for expertise in environmental field in Indonesia. And our vision for this program is to become the center of education and research for addressing the environmental issues. And this is with the broader vision of University of Indonesia, that is a vision of making a world-class research university. World-class research university. And our mission is to create graduates who hold not only for academic competency in environmental science, but importantly, a greater sense of responsibility and duty to the needs of Indonesia with regard to the environmental issues. We are in our program have a motto, a simple motto, to get patient to finding and develop the innovative solution for the sustainability of our community, of our cities, of our regions, of our nations, and our global world. This academic year of our program, Environmental Science program, have graduated 841 master students, 841 master students, and 110 doctor students. That were paid, and a large number of them now hold a strategic position within these universities in Indonesia, in the ministries, in the institutes, government bodies, and also in the private sector. And before us, the audience know, all of the students here, and also me and the lecturer, we are potential leaders for our future of the nations. So please take this opportunity to actively participate in this discussion and explore approaches to addressing the challenges of creating the better of environment for all of us. Okay, I think I hope this discussion and this lecture for us related to sustainable development, and I hope that the students here could participate actively to explore about the innovative solution for the sustainable of the environment and nations and our world. Thank you for the welcome. We're still waiting for the Prof. Emil Salim, but we move to the key agenda, and I give to the moderator and the MC. Thank you.
Thank you, Bu Sari. I have just received news that Professor Nasawi cannot join us. I'm very sorry to give you that news. Now I would like to invite Dr. Mari Mulyani to the stage to give an introduction to our guest speaker, and yeah.
Yes. Thank you. It is now my great pleasure to introduce our speaker. Ambassador Broderick is the United Nations Secretary General's designated representative in Indonesia and leads the UN country team of residents and non-resident agencies. He had previously at UNDP Cambodia. Educated at the University of California, Berkeley, and completed the Senior Managers Program at Harvard University, Mr. Broderick has 30 years of international development experience working as a senior manager with the United Nations in countries such as Bangladesh, China, North Korea, Armenia, the former Yugoslavia, Eritrea, Rwanda, and Djibouti. Mr. Broderick also worked with the relief services in countries such as Iraq, Jerusalem, the West Bank and Gaza, Egypt and Thailand. Ambassador Broderick, with your vast international development experience, particularly in the developing countries, it is indeed our privilege for having the opportunity today to listen to your thoughts and insight, particularly in an important agenda for sustainable development. Only last week, the new goals and targets of sustainable development were decided during the United Nations Summit in New York. Without more delay, I now invite Ambassador Broderick to present his lecture. After yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mali Mulyani, and distinguished professors, ladies and gentlemen, dear students. I'm very happy to be here at your Ambassador's Lecture Series, and I think it's very important that we talk about the environment. I first came to Indonesia in 1982. So I can talk to you, frankly speaking, about how things looked in terms of the environment in 1982 compared to what I see in 2015. And my explorations in 1982 in Indonesia covered Java. I went to Bali, which I think all of you know has tremendously changed. Change. And I also traveled to time was a pristine rainforest and only covered by buses and dirt roads. But things definitely have changed. And what I'll do today is we'll dialogue together in terms of 3 series. I'll lead in to discuss with you, as Professor Mulyani talked about, the Sustainable Development Goals, 17 of them which were approved in New York. And a lot of them are orientated around environment, which I'll go into. So I'll give you a general picture of those Sustainable Development Goals. And then we'll get into some specifics of what the UN is doing. Environmental governance work that we're doing. And then you also asked me for some insights and ideas on policy and policy making. And I'll leave you with those insights and those ideas going down the road. I think all of us are very proud that last week we had the Sustainable Development Goals at the General Assembly in New York. And they were taking into account the diversity of getting the complex things together in the world. Indonesia participated in that in terms of a high-level panel. So now, right now, we have Sustainable Development Goals, and we have 17 of them newly formed last week that all of us have to wrap around between now and 2013. The issues and the goals addressed are similar to those of the process of lots of things that you study here at the University of Indonesia. So I look forward to that discussion and the ways that you can link your work and your studies to these Sustainable Development Goals. It's going to be a very important, pivotal year for years for Indonesia, especially Indonesia is and there's significant challenges, as all of us know, in terms of deforestation. And you don't have to look too far to see what's happening in terms of the haze, in terms of affecting development prospects and affecting economic work going down the road. And it also affects what the UN is doing and the work that we do with the government of Indonesia. Indonesia has had many successes with the millennium. Indonesia, 28 million people that live below the national poverty line, which is creating a rising inequality in Indonesia. I think you know about a marker called the Gini coefficient. That is 0.41 in Indonesia, and that is rising So there's unequal incomes, there's poor, and there's very rich. And that's a concern for us in Indonesia, along with other countries of the world, such as Brazil and Philippines. Another thing that we're very concerned about in terms of in Indonesia, we're very worried about Indonesia being stuck in a middle income trap, where the income and the quality of life doesn't rise significantly to the economy and the potential of the country to grow and prosper greater. There's some specific things that I said that I would get into and talk to you about. With HIV, which is too high, and it's of new infections of HIV. It's a country of concern for us. We're concerned about Pakistan, we're concerned about the Philippines, and we're concerned about Indonesia in terms of the trend is not looking good on HIV. Children's health. Our biggest concern on children's health is stunting. That's where children are not growing height for weight that they should be. They should be of stunting is years old. And that's something very significantly, a big picture thing for us to look at in terms of children's health. It's a very complex problem in terms of policy. It's not something that's easily achieved or easily stopped. Open defecation, unfortunately, sanitation conditions are not the best in Indonesia, and we have the second highest rate of open defecation in the world after India. There's up to over 60 million people in Indonesia without potable water, without adequate sanitation, or adequate toilet facilities. And this is a very important goal when in terms of sanitation. It creates diseases, it creates illness, it creates a burden for society, it costs money and time, and affects manpower. We look at inequality in disadvantaged areas in Indonesia. We look at Aceh, and we look at Eastern Indonesia for areas that are lagging significantly behind other regions and areas of Indonesia. Those are areas where we want to have higher priority, better health care, better economic opportunities, more development work going into those areas. Unfortunately, over 30 women a day in Indonesia die giving life. Maternal mortality rate. Women giving birth, dying. Indonesia has a very high maternal mortality rate. It's over 300 per. And it's a picture of great thing that's very important in terms of safe births, less women dying giving life, and it's something that is a priority for the health agencies and the health organizations of the UN. Environment. We know that Indonesia has the third largest tropical forest in the world, and yet it has one of the highest. Scientists and study this, and obviously there's different numbers from different sources, but people are saying deforestation 1.5%, 2%. There's different estimates, different definitions, but it's not good. And it's something that all of us are obviously concerned about with Indonesia also because of this, being the third largest producer of greenhouse gases behind the US and China. Environment. The UN continues to work with the Indonesian government on environment issues, and we've had extensive cooperation with the universities, with the academic community on this. And we support to help the government create policies that help the country build, but more so protect the environment and the people. UN agencies are working on the ground and regulations and policies, helping government in terms of enforcement, protection, and environment future-looking, along with green economy. The MDGs have a standalone environmental protection goal, and please know that that is goal number 7, to ensure environmental sustainability. Under that, targets are to reduce greenhouse emissions, to protect ecosystems, and to ensure access to safe drinking water, environmentally sound, among a lot of other indicators that we're looking at. With the agreement on the SDGs this past Friday, we're progressing with the recognition that the environmental issues are cross-cutting and their interests intersect with other development goals. And the environment and understanding of the importance of this is very important for you to understand the SDGs. Number 6 is sustainable water management. It links into number 7, which is affordable and clean energy. Number 13 is combating climate change. Number 14 is a very interesting goal in terms of protecting the oceans and utilizing marine resources. The 17 SDGs recognize that preserving the environment with the adaptation of these goals to make the efforts to protect our Earth, and that's the bottom line where they come together. And I'll explain to you, we have a very interesting forest ecosystem evaluation study which we've been doing. And a number of UN agencies with the government recognize the importance of the country's forest and the necessity of protecting it. And what I'd like to highlight would be a few select examples of the UN in the country, rights, maritime protection, and some other environmental issues. These include looking at ways to value the country's natural capital, its forest. Indonesia's forests are critical to the economic growth, and quantifying that value can assist Indonesia as it moves, as all of you know, to a green economy. The UN Environmental Program and the UN Office for Red Plus Coordination in Indonesia recently released, for instance, the Forest Ecosystem Valuation Study. And the study highlights the significance of the contributions provided by the country's forests that often are not accounted for in the mainstream decision-making of social and impacts that we have going down the road. This quantitative evidence of the study investments in forest ecosystems and promote the sustainable management of natural resources. An example of a key finding is that the upstream timber industry added more than $14 billion to the Indonesian economy, which we calculated in 2012 as part of this study. The work this study does model, which we're working on in Indonesia. Such a model of equitable growth in the poor who dropped out of livelihoods are not negatively affected affected by this, as well as supporting stable economic development and preserving the natural world. I'd like to mention another thing that we're working on is the Forest Governance Index. I think all of you are aware of that the biggest problem that in terms of protecting and governing forests is the government enforcement and government governance of forests. And this year, UNDP has released a Forest Governance Index, a way to monitor the governance of forests across the 34 provinces of Indonesia. And the index is a result of the recognition that in order to prosper and to reduce poverty and inequality, Indonesia must continue to curb deforestation and work very, very hard to protect its forests. Forests support nearly 50 million Indonesians who live, many of them who live on less than $2 a day, and generate 75% of their household income from this ecosystem exchange. This was confirmed recently by a report that came from the UN Environment Program and UNDP, which was conducted in central Kalimantan. Good governance is at the heart of making and improving the protection of Indonesia's forests and marine resources. Good governance is ensuring that public systems, innovations, and laws protect forests and peatlands to work effectively for the benefit of the Indonesian people. And good governance is about ensuring people access to the forests also. The benefits from the forest, natural resources, are distributed fairly and equally. The Forest Governance Index has provided a tool to gauge the quality and the robustness of forest governance and ecosystem mechanism of Indonesia. On a scale of 100, Indonesia has recorded a national average of 36, indicating that there's lots of room to move on governance of forests for Indonesia, given the capacity constraints. The report also revealed a number of common challenges needed to work on spatial planning and land tenure regulations, as well as limited community participation in forest management, and in addition to, obviously, as all of us know, weak enforcement of laws and regulations. In addressing some challenges, lessons can be learned from provinces such as Central Sulawesi, Jambi, which scored highest in the index. Central Sulawesi's number one rank is attributed in part to the transparency of its spatial planning process and the fact that forest regulations were strengthened and land use conflicts decreased. An effective conflict resolution process that was instituted there in terms of land conflicts, land tenure conflicts, which worked out unique systems to tackle that, which is an underlying cause in many cases in terms of forestry governance. Indonesia is the first country in the world to launch and regulate and conduct comprehensive forest governance assessments, including stakeholders from government, civil society, and the private sector. Other forest countries, such as Vietnam and Nigeria, are looking to Indonesia to learn from these pioneering experiences. Monitoring forest governance is essential, especially in a wide swath of Kalimantan and Sumatra, covered in haze because of the yearly burning of forests and peatland. The UN has projects on the ground in Sumatra that are working to prevent the degradation of these areas. And including the re-wetting of peatlands, which is something we're working on, as they continue to act as carbon sinks and is then more difficult for them to catch fire. Aside from the on-the-ground work on potential re-wetting, policy work that looks at the economic value of the economy and that addresses the importance of governance, the UN works with addressing education and the importance for the future of environmental protection for the country. As you know, Kuliah Kerja Nyata is a program of thematic community work for university students in remote areas. In July 2014, our Red Plus agency prepared university students for KKN in villages of West Sumatra and Merauke with a list of community-based activities that give great priority to green development in these villages. Students conveyed sustainable messages in their target locations and expanded their knowledge of Red Plus. In West Sumatra, the program's goal is to gradually empower communities to manage on their own 500,000 hectares of forest by 2016, a target which was set by the governor. Students submit ideas, scrutinize local institutions, explore business ideas, and learn about the issues of reducing emissions from deforestation, forest, and peatland degradation. With 500,000 hectares of community-managed land, the potential benefits could be ecological, economic, social, and cultural, and we hope to implemented by youth, which is a priority for the UN in terms of working with Indonesia, where over 1/3 of the population is under the age of 30 years old, is important for us to continue this process, especially with education and learning at the grassroots level. As I hope you can see from these examples, the environmental work the UN has been doing is cross-cutting. Some relate to forest policy, some relate to government policy, some to monitoring, others to local initiatives. They all work to achieve one or more of the Sustainable Development Goals just agreed upon that will take us to 2030. There are so many vast archipelago of 17,000 islands, especially with work in disadvantaged areas such as Aceh, Papua, and eastern Indonesia, and projects that should address health, livelihoods, disease, and projects that will focus on agriculture, water, and the seas. We want to continue to achieve and work on our country team, our country agencies. There's 26 UN agencies in Indonesia, and we have 1,400 staff. The team has achieved a lot in recent years, but we always look forward to those challenges and in the coming 5 years. And diversity in terms of working on these issues. I know that you asked me also in terms of providing some insights in terms of all of you are leaders, all of you are going to be responsible for the environment in the future. The environment is ours, and together we work to protect the environment. So I thought that I would give you some tips and ideas in terms of policy making and insights into policy. One, house. The real world that we work in is messy and very chaotic for policy and policy making. You'll need to acknowledge that and accept that and move beyond this messiness. Two, get the big idea right. We need to work with all partners and different angles and challenges to get the big picture, the big idea right, and finding that idea and moving down the road with that big idea correctly. 3, investigate a framework document. Many times making policy, you can go back to core values and tenets. Schools have charters. The UN has the SDG. Countries have constitutions. Companies have mission statements. So you need to make with these sorts of framework documents in the future. 4, we are not all lawyers, but check the law. Make sure that when you develop a policy that is legal, and you and all of your partners respect and abide by the bylaws, regulations, and directives that are in place as best as possible. 5, build the flexibility in dates. The world changes very much, and a time frame on policies can be useful. It gives your policies as you go down into the policy implementing period. 6, use big data to measure. Find big data ways and people to incorporate into your policy studies, especially to justify policy, but also to measure your impact of policy as you implement it. 7, reach for the highest level. You need to reach for the highest level to get full support when you implement policies. Big policies with big impact need big levels. 8, get the big number okay. People get all sorts of numbers when they do policies and estimates on the policy budget impact, and lots of time people get it wrong. But you should work as best as possible to get that number okay and in a reasonable range. You're not going to get a perfect number. Nobody's going of your policy in terms of cost. 9, inclusion is good, but too much can delay. Include partners and people is good, but don't let the inclusion process overwhelm your policy process, especially lots of discussions and lots of time going on. 10, Twitter policy. Twitter has 140 characters. Some people, and you should be able to explain your policy in simple characters, in a simple way. If it's too complex, watch out. 11, go beyond the room policy. Ensure that you have involved people we sit in capitals amidst conference rooms and windows and do not listen to the voice of the people from the rice field or from the village or the man on the street or the disadvantaged or the disfranchised. But we must make sure that they are heard and incorporated into our policies. I'd like to mention that the United Nations Climate Change Conference in Paris will be called COP21, and later on in the year, in December, this will be the first time in 20 years that the UN agencies will be trying to work on a binding and a universal agreement for climate change. And all the nations of the world, including Indonesia, will be there. And this will be creating a legally binding obligation for countries to reduce greenhouse emissions. And these are important discussions that will occur in Paris, because it's essential for us to work together to tackle climate change from carbon reduction. I'm glad to be here today, and we at the UN relationships, like yourself, because you're going to be the ones in the future making policy decisions. And we welcome closer ties with bright students like yourselves. Our challenge is how to foster sustainable development and how to put the global sustainable development's goals into practice, and how to how to improve the lives of all the Indonesians. I think you're aware that Indonesia is now a middle-income country, and with this comes an expected increased responsibility and expectation for greater growth and greater development going down the road that would be financed and self-financed by Indonesia. And this includes also the opportunity to save and preserve and protect the environment in terms of Indonesia. I'd like to thank and I thank Dr. Mary Mulyani, Professor, for her leadership and her bringing us here to this wonderful event today. We can talk to you about the UN, the Sustainable Development Goals, some work that the UN is doing in terms of forest sites and ideas for you. And I look forward very, very much to our discussion. And as you started today, I'll end in terms of together we create a better environment. Terima kasih banyak.
Well, thank you very much, Ambassador Broderick, for your very insightful and comprehensive lecture. And out of the 11 tips, if we could try to remember 3, each one of us, I think we are successful in doing this discussion. And what I can remember is, 1, move beyond messiness. And I think I can remember, get the right. So over to you later. 3 of the 11 tips. So thank you again. And I would like to open this discussion with the first 3 questions. And when you ask the question, could you please mention your name and from which program of study in this Pasca Sarjana you're from? Thank you. Please, the first 3 questions. Jangan malu, silakan Mbak.
Broderick, the rank number 35 in terms of Forest Governance Index actually has shown clearly that we are left behind. So this regard, I would like to ask about the program that is actually initiated in 1986, which is the National Forest Inventory that is initiated actually by UN also. That is the first national inventory that we have. And after that, we saw no such inventory done. Actually, in terms of basic data about the land cover and land use data, we Indonesia actually don't have serial. Even the very elementary data, we don't have this complete serial data of the NFI. So I would like to have your comment on this, because making policy has to be based on the, like you say, the correct data and complete data. So when we come to this fact that, or when the very elementary factors that we lack of, so how can we hope that we will be able to come to the very good policy? And thank you also about the 11th insights that you have given. But I hope that you precisely convey the same message to the government, not to us. Well, we hope that the UN can voice the precisely similar tips for the governments, because this is I think the core of the government is in its initial position. It's very key to the whole with your experience of international development in developing countries. How do you rate Indonesia's progress in sustainable development when compared with its Asian peers? I mean, compared to our neighboring countries. Well, I could assume that we are left behind, but I would like to hear it from you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. May we have your name?
Ya, lupa saking semangatnya. Sore joined the doctoral program here in the environment science program. Thank you.
Thank you. Could I have the second question, please?
Sorry.
Yes, silakan.
Thank you, Mr. Broderick, for your excellent speech. I want to ask you about, actually, sustainability development already discussed since maybe in 48 years ago. But I think some of the citizens in Indonesia still not enjoy or reach the goals. That's why maybe our government, or maybe the government changed the Millennium Goal development to sustainability development. I want to ask you that what's maybe the factor, or what Millennium Development Goals to sustainability? Actually, you already explained a little bit in your speech, but I think why they didn't make some effort or strategy to reach the Millennium Development Goal. They in spite to change become sustainability development. It is clear? Okay, thank you.
Okay. Next question before I give the time for Ambassador Broderick to answer the third one. I Silakan. Di belakang Pak. Atau Pak Hasrul. Oh, Pak Hasrul. Mic-nya untuk Pak Hasrul.
I already said that there are always both sides. One says that the global anthropogenic global warming is hoax. The other say no, it is really happening. How can you since both give two reasons? How do hotspots along Sumatra? If you make a trip at the end of dry season, you will see that people burn forests because they have to plant rice, because they eat rice. Well, actually, the smoke is not because someone has want to open sawit estates. No, I think because they want to eat rice, subsistence. What do you think? Like Papua, they do not eat rice. They not burn the forest. They eat sago, they eat talas, yeah. Not also Kalimantan, but Sumatra, the whole Sumatra eat rice. They must every year. If we have an increase of 2% per year, with a 250 million population, we have an increase of 5 million. There are addition of 5 million want to eat rice. Per year, it needs 120 kilograms. So you have to 600 in production. How do you? What do you think? Can we just say it easy? This is a problem actually. So, in my opinion, because people want to eat rice, because they want to plant rice. I have been, I've made travel. I've been along Sumatra since 1980. 1980, so it's more than 20 years ago, almost every year. I saw them. Because they burn the forest because they want to eat. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello? Thank you. Lots of rich questions. Okay, our first forestry data is a huge problem. I know that in some areas that we worked in, we've had up to 50 different maps of land tenure, boundaries, forestry areas, and in local areas. We're trying as best as possible, we're working on a one map policy and procedure with local governments where we get one map that everybody agrees to. Yes, easier said than done. And I know the work from 1986 in terms of the UN Forestry Index. We're trying as best as possible in terms of getting the data, collecting the data, setting up data systems, IT systems, especially at the provincial and sub-district levels to look at that. It's a big challenge. It's not something that's going to happen overnight. It's a scratch and fight with the data as best as possible. Because you're right, you need the data to correct and implement forestry governance protection. You mentioned about the, in terms of, let me give you, you mentioned about challenges that Indonesia had, and I'll give you, you talked about what kind of things are there in terms of the good picture. I think, Doctor, you mentioned, and I'll bring this in, Indonesia has done an incredible job feeding its people. You talk about 255 million people. and 255 million people are fed. Obviously, there's a challenge with the 5 million, but that's been an extraordinary. Indonesia doesn't have that, so okay, there's stunting, which is something else, but there isn't people starving. Indonesia also has done a terrific job in terms of poverty alleviation. When I came here in 1982 for the first time, there was significant poverty. And let's face it, I had a man go down the aisle begging, and he had elephantitis, and he was begging, and it just, I remember the image for the rest of my life. I was just blown away. That is not in the picture. Indonesia has reduced from the 50% that were poor, let's say living under $1 a day, 1.4% poverty line. That's a pretty big accomplishment and achievement that we need to acknowledge that has been done, which is significant. Along with that, moving an economy to a $1 trillion economy in the world. And probably the other thing is that you can look around. You don't have to look further than the 200 shopping malls in Jakarta. You can look in Medan and Surabaya and other places, cities where there's a tremendous rise in the middle class in Indonesia. We will be seeing 122 million, 130 million people in the next, let's say, 10 to 15 years rise significantly into the middle income, which is a great accomplishment. Talk to me about, are you giving me? Yes, we are. That's our job. We can talk to the government about that. Now, we may be giving that tips, that technical advice to the government. That doesn't necessarily say that that's going to be implemented tomorrow. I cannot guarantee that. But that is our constant message to the government, those kind of 11 tips what we're working on. Because at the end of the day, the biggest role that the UN has in the future with the Indonesian government is we have to provide appropriate and upstream technical assistance to the government. And that's our role. We also have a role in terms of telling the Indonesian government or an HIV, or maybe on the maternal mortality rate, that, hey, wait a minute, we need to do some kind of more work on this. We need to look at the policy on that. So indeed, that's the role that we do, and I probably spend more than half my day working on that in terms of influencing, advocating, and prototyping different types of policy upstream with the Indonesian government. So yes, indeed, that's important. Believe me, it's a very difficult role to do, because especially you're in a middle-income country. And in a middle-income country, development assistance and traditional donors that give money for aid have basically, money has lessened and traditional donors have left, because Indonesia has had significant progress. I think the per capita income, depending upon the index that you want to use, is $3,600 or $4,200 per person per year into the lower middle income. You asked the question, the young lady asked the question, why change the goals from the MDGs to the SDGs? I think this is a member state process, including Indonesia. And I know the initial was the Millennium Development Goals were 8, and then it was proposed to 17, and then it was proposed now, finally approved. Proposed to 13, and then it was proposed to maybe less than 17 goals. A lot of us would like to have seen less than 169 indicators that we're going to have to monitor. But the member states, 193 member states of the United Nations, had this discussion and agreed on this. You can imagine the thousands of hours of people in rooms developing this policy and developing the Sustainable Development Goals. It cost a lot of coffee and tea for sure. But they came out with, I'm very happy that they were able to agree with it. Trying to get member states, as you know, to agree on anything. You know, you look at the Security Council, you look at Syria, you look at some other parts of the world, and it's very hard to get an agreement on approaches. And here, member states, all 193, agreed to these 17 goals. So I take that as an achievement. Okay, we'll have to monitor those 17 goals. You asked me a scientific question on global warming. And I'll put it this way, that at the end of the day, there's all sorts of scientists talking about global warming in terms of the, let's say, the thin crust. We as human beings, whether we realize it or not, we live on a very, 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 very thin edge of the world. We live on, let's say, no more than 25 kilometers of an edge that supports us as human beings, with oxygen, with water, with food, with sunlight, with plants, and protection from the radiation. That fragile, and where I would come from is that we know very well the damage that man is doing to the planet. Debates on the warming exercise, and there could be esoteric scientific things on the world is warming. Okay, fine. I'm not going down on the planetary discussion. If we just look at the bottom line and say the damage going on is very, very significant, it's something that I get very concerned. Going down a river, and the river was very beautiful, and there was white foam, and the foam was like Disneyland castle foam, and just spilling over, and it looked beautiful. Oh, it was gorgeous, and it decorated kilometers and kilometers of the river, and it looked really, really wonderful. So I said to my guide, the government official I was with, I said, "What is this?" And he looked at me and said, "Please understand, please don't think I'm stupid." And I said to him, "Hey, what is this really?" And kilometers. And he turned around finally to me after I pressed him and said, it was a paper mill that was dumping stuff in this very beautiful, pristine stream. And, you know, for me, that was a big eye-opener, just a little example of what man is doing, big picture. And it doesn't what's going on that and how that impacts and creates global warming and lots of the environmental problems we have. In terms of subsistence, and I know that in terms of us tackling the haze problem and tackling the what our biggest concern is, you know, this being cleared as we know it's not too scientific. It's being cleared, a lot of it for palm oil producers. The issue is, okay, they're clearing it, it's being burnt out for that. Obviously I think it's 2 hectares or less, families can, you know, clear land and get that. people who are violating that law and clearing stuff in cohesion, possibly with local groups and local partners, are ones violating the law. And how much of those people are brought to enforcement or into some sort of regulatory process that can stop them from doing that, which is a big question that we ask in terms of the fires going on right now. Thank you.
Okay, I think one question from Pak Sal. Indonesia has the question was, how would you rate the Indonesians' progress in MDGs compared to Indonesian?
I would say it's pretty good. But Indonesia has to look at two things. The poverty alleviation has been done well, and the locomotive goes down the track in terms of the economy moving from 1 to 2 trillion. But that was done in terms of on an extraction model, extracting commodities, extracting coal, extracting natural resources, including timber. 1/3 to 50%. Indonesia will need to move into what you call the service economy or the new economy, and also into what we call the green economy. And that's going to be a bigger challenge for Indonesia to move into. The biggest thing that Indonesia needs to look at and is lagging is that the health indicators, I mentioned especially stunting and the maternal mortality rate and the HIV, which is things that we're worried about in terms of impact in the community. And one other thing that I do mention is the quality of education. Obviously, you're all here as university students, and you're all exceptional students and exceptional human beings to be here at the university. But 7.5 years average schooling of an Indonesian citizen is not going to cut it or advance Indonesia to an information, a service, an upstream economy going down the road. So the quality of education for greater Indonesian citizens needs to be looked at, and there needs to be improvements made in that. There's a list of improvements that all of you know about in terms of education that need to be done, because 7.5 years is not going to be competitive, nor competitive in the global economic environment.
Please. And then after Bapak, and then this one, and then you number 3. Thank you.
I was inspired by one saying or quoting Vice President Ismail Sabri, who said that if the war of this century, was fought over oil, because of oil, the wars of the next century will be fought over water. Your idea about the availability of water today, because I read the United Nations report on water, and it is written that water and energy are very crucial for human well-being and sustainable socio-economic development. And now, the water and energy are closely interrelated. But the problem is that we deal with the energy with the high cost. We create energy with economics, but we lack water. Something is not very important like energy. At the same time, we know that water needs energy. you know, without water, we cannot have power plant. Almost power plant need water for feeding water, for cooling water, including biofuel. So I need to know your idea, your unit to conserve water, especially for tropical country like Indonesia. Thank you.
Thank you. Welcome, Prof. Emil. Yeah. May I have your name, please?
Oh, my name Hussein.
Next question, please.
This is your Social Good Summit, and I have a question for you too. Actually, I spent 6 years in Ambon in provincial government, and you mentioned about green economy, which is not really popular in provincial Indonesia, because many of them, the majority of the people in government, is still growth oriented. Okay, we have now sustainable development goals. We want to improve the quality of people. We want to have better education and education. How can we finance that without economic growth? And that's we can see now. We want economic by what? By cutting more trees, by polluting our rivers. So my question is, do you have best suggestion to deliver the idea of sustainable development to the government in provincial and district levels in Indonesia, but still oriented in economic growth? And last, can we please have the copy of your 11 tips? Thank you.
Thank you. And the third question for this session, please.
Okay, thank you very much for the time. My opinion that several forum has justified some academia that the agenda of protocol Kyoto maybe has failed. So because our discussion now is also talk about transforming our world. The 2000 next, what you suggest to the CP1 next to voice sustainable development. I think.
Okay, I think it's Pak Hussein. Your point about water is spot on. I was in the USA in May, and I met with a CEO of a water company, American Water Works. Bring potable water to villages and make sure people get drinking water. And we're not even talking about the issue of repairing the infrastructure already that people get water in, which is dilapidated and which needs trillions and trillions of dollars, not only in Jakarta, not only in Indonesia, but all around the world. And indeed, you look at what's going on in places like California and Australia, and now we're being impacted in Indonesia by El Nino. Water is going to be a big problem. One thing more money in the future. they need financing on that. And the other thing that we realize that conflict will be inevitable with the scarcity of water going on down the road. One thing that I do want to mention in terms of Indonesia in energy needs to have, Indonesia has a potential of 50% of the thermal energy of the world, and that needs to be tapped in. We need to let people come in and invest in that and bring that to the Indonesian village. The aspect that we look at in terms of thermostats, manufacturing of electrical goods, working on things like that to use less energy. That's why we have electric cars. But in the future, that industry, that intervention will play a greater and greater and greater role going down the road. You also talked about, there was something that, let's say, local governments have to find a way to budget these kind of interventions and support them and financing together. It could be energy bonds, it could be attracting the private sector to invest in energy efficient, private sector maybe to invest more in the thermal energy sector, but it has to have an environment that encourages the flow of investment, both internally and externally, to create green economy, energy efficient investments and interventions in the future. But I think the whole story about water needs more attention for everybody. The days of you going into your bathroom and turning on your faucet and water comes out, that might become more of a privilege, an expensive privilege, rather than a fundamental right. So keep your eye on that. That's going to be a significant problem that the world is going to be encroaching on. And the other thing is that you have this dilapidated water infrastructure of the world that serves 7 million people. What are you going to do when you have 9 million people? Or how is Indonesia going to provide water for 300 million people when the population increases by 5 million a year up from the 255 million? Now, I had the example, and thanks for coming for the Good Summit the other day. I could be blunt and say, okay, if local governments want to work, I can say, well, the best thing to do is stop corruption. That's a beginning thing, but that's a very easy answer to a very complex thing. But what I think the big thing to do is, in terms of governments need to have that we've been working on in terms of working with the sub-district, the district levels, in terms of how they're budgeting, how they can do green economy budgeting, how they're using their resources, their fiscal resources. One other thing that some of the administrative budgets, the sub-district and district levels need to do is, on the 501 districts in Indonesia, is something on the revenue collection, because we all know that in Indonesia there's 27 tax ID people, and there's only roughly about 900,000 taxpayers who are significantly paying taxes. So obviously those kind of local taxes and administration of that, without creating a burden on the population, would be one way for local government to try to get the financing going down the road. The other thing that I do point out, and it's unfortunate, that financing from external sources in terms of development assistance, in terms of grants, is going to be less and less and less. And that's something that local governments will have to live with, especially in Aceh, Papua, and East Indonesia. Of the 11 tips. And the big thing, one of those 11 tips that I mentioned is budgeting. And you might say, oh, what's this guy talking about budgeting? I'll give you an example of budgeting. In my country, there's a program called Medicare, and that is elderly insurance for people over, let's say, 65 or 67. And I'll give you some round numbers. They said that this is going to cost in the future, let's say, I'll give you $1. Created 23. They missed the estimate by 2,300%. The estimate was totally off in terms of the number. Now Indonesia is going through that because Indonesia is going to be implementing a comprehensive healthcare insurance going into 2018, 2019. And that number, in terms of budgeting that, in terms of implications, is going to be very important for people to look at. So my warning is to local governments and sub-district and district governments, be very acutely aware of your budgetary implications and find better ways in terms of budgeting and get that picture right. Because down the road, there's going to be more and more things and processes and policies possibly hung on the provincial governments that they're going to need more creative ways of financing and making sure that they account for those future expenditures and those future obligations moving on. And what do we want out of the discussions and what we can do? Hopefully there will be agreement. I believe they've met 20 times, and this is the 21st time, which is why it's called COP 21. I hope that they have an agreement. I think if they reduction targets that the government has done in terms of 23%, and something about 42% in general. If there's an unfortunate event that the countries around the world don't, specific countries will have to take individual commitments and actions to reduce their carbon emissions and agree to do that, whether they like it or not. But let's hope that this has a lot of momentum, and there's a lot of political participation at the big level, and let's hope that they can all make an agreement on that. And obviously Indonesia is a very significant player on COP21 with the third largest emissions after China and the US. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, is there any silakan Pak Hasrul.
Well, you mentioned the geothermal, like one of the solutions. Well, in my research, I know that the steam brought up from the geothermal contains uranium, thorium, radioactive radionuclides, primordial radionuclides. Well, it is not easy. You have to make research on that more, because it contains, well, radioactive primordial radioactive. What do you think?
I'll give you an answer on that. What you just said to me was alternative fuel, fossil fuel, and that is true. I think per unit, these are round figures. Per unit, the fossil fuel is 25 cents per unit to deliver to the consumer. While right now, the alternative fuel is 83 cents to deliver to the consumer. Alternative fuel thermal, including what you talked about. I know that there has been some progress done in the solar industry, but still we're not there. And there needs to be a lot doing. I would anticipate there'll be a manufacturing revolution on this. Things that, those costs have to go down. Because at the end of the day, if you want an alternative fuel alternative fuel, you can't continue around the world subsidizing it. I forget the figure, but it's up to something like there's $100 trillion which is more than the world's economy. The world's economy is roughly about $70, $75 trillion, 80 trillion. But there's something like over the value of the world's economy of subsidies. And just in general, comprehensively, there's subsidies for fuel, there's subsidies for alternative energy, there's subsidies for fossil fuel, there's subsidies for the agricultural systems. And I know that Indonesia has been lucky in terms of a big achievement in the beginning of the current administration. But I think that the world needs to work, all countries need to work on getting that subsidy down, and reducing subsidies, especially for alternative fuel. And the other thing that we've seen, but it's been really, really painstaking progress, is the alternative energy sector. Believe me, there's things that we've worked on, like for instance, I've worked on solar lanterns that are, sun that reach the small farmers, but we had lots of issues with the quality, with the costing. It's still not there yet. We have to get it right, and it will become right, but it's a long manufacturing innovation struggle that will take a while going down the road. Because you're not going to be about to pay 25 cents for fossil fuel while your alternative fuel is 83 cents. Of course, your consumer or your average person or your poor farmer is going to revert to the cheaper model.
Thank you. Last question, please. This is become last question. Okay. Related to this theme of the 2030 Agenda for the Sustainable Development, and then we start now in the 2015. So we have 15 years, a roadmap for the Sustainable Development Agenda for 2030. So what's your suggestion and to make it in briefing, down to earth, to the policy in the roadmap of the 15 years to the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. And also, the first question is about the government, that you should convey this message for the government, but I think we are in academic, as a student, as a lecturer, also has a key should have play thank you.
On your last point, it would be useful if we with you in terms of ways we ships. It could be a dialogue series with you. It could be policy briefs in terms of helping us with research, which we always need. It could be secondment of staff or students to the UN agencies to help on some of the significant policy that work that we need to do. Believe me, there's a lot of work that we need to do, and all the help that we can get in terms of the UN. We're not the ones only carrying the load. All the help that we can get from you to help the UN agencies would be greatly appreciated from the University of Indonesia. So we look forward to that. Your point on the Sustainable Development Goals, I'll give you a good little example. I mentioned it the other day at the Good Summit that we were at. It would be very nice to knock on the door of every one of the 72,000 villages in Indonesia and knock on the door of the village head and say, how are you? Can I look at your SDG report card? Can I And my point is that action plans need to go down as best as possible to the lowest possible level. So if I saw an SDG scorecard or plan for every single village that we could implement, or the villages, and the village heads, and the village and show and get going as an action plan in every single village, I think that would be a very significant achievement. The other thing on the SDGs, which is very important, you might be able to help with this, is that they could be very useful for curriculum and for education, especially at the primary school level. There could be some incorporation of that in a small way, without a lot of expense, into the schools, the primary schools of Indonesia. I think there's like, I think it was 1.5 million primary schools, if I'm correct, a number like that. Maybe that included the high schools and junior high schools. But something along that line of incorporating the SDGs into the curriculum and educating this parade of future leaders and the future generation of Indonesia. And you have every single one of those, let's say 5 million or 6 million students per year coming out of school, and they can go, oh yeah, I know a little bit about the Sustainable Development Goals. Number 14 is we need to protect our oceans. Number 1 is we need to reduce poverty. And if we could create an awareness like that, I think that would have a very, very big impact in terms of monitoring and measuring the impact and getting the advocacy and people's participation in the third largest democracy in Indonesia on the agenda of the students, on the agenda of the future people and the voters of Indonesia, to move so to impact the government of Indonesia moving down the road in the future to enhance and implement the SDG for development for generations to come.
Thank you very much. Professor.
I'd like to express my appreciation to Ambassador Dr. Broderick. His Excellency Dr. Broderick is United Nations Resident Co-Coordinator, and the UN consists of UNFPA, Family Planning, FAO, Agriculture, UNIDO, Industry, ILO, Labor, and so on. His Excellency Dr. Broderick is coordinating all these various UN agencies in the field of industry, agriculture, education, culture, and so on. What does it mean? It means that His Excellency Dr. Broderick is exactly doing the sustainable development. Because the essence of sustainable development is not economic development only. It is economic development together with social development and environmental development. Economic development is clear cut. You have the industry of agriculture. But social development, you have family planning, children, education, and environment is environment and the UNEP. So what the section that Broderick is telling us is actually in Jakarta as the United Nations Residence Coordinator. Therefore, it's important to know exactly how must sustainable development be in action. How can we coordinate economic, social, and environment into one coherent exercise, action, and to achieve the goal, the first goal of the 17 principles of the Sustainable Development Goal is zero poverty at 2030. It requires efforts to control the infant mortality rate. It requires raising health, improving infrastructure, and so on. The talk given to us today reveals His Excellency Dr. Broderick's experience in coordinating the UN agencies, and therefore we need to appreciate what he is delivering us, telling us, because he day to day is exactly doing what the environment. I say thank you very much for doing it.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Prof. Emil. And we are all aware that Prof. Emil is known as the guru of sustainable development in Indonesia. As early as 1972, Prof. Emil led the Indonesian delegation to the United Nations Conference on the Human Environment. So, yes, we are privileged to have Prof. Emil and Your Excellency. Thank you very much for your very insightful lecture. And thank you all for participating. Before I close this session, I would like to just make a very brief summary for, take home message. Has elevated poverty from 50% to 11.4%, also moved the economy from 1 to 3 trillion. However, this economic growth has been based on the extractive of natural resource. So the challenge is how, again, as Prof. Emil mentioned, to put the environment and social and economy in the right place of the sustainable development. And there are a lot of homework for Indonesia when it comes to inequality. As governance index is so there is a big challenge of middle income trap in Indonesia. And as an academic community, we would really like to take a kind offer from Ambassador Broderick to make a future cooperation between the UN in Indonesia and UI, PSDN UI. Thank you very much, and may I invite you to give a round of applause to Mr. Jones and Mr. Brown. Thank
Thank you, Dr. Ambassador Broderick. Now we would like to invite Professor Enel Salim to say a few words.
Thank you. Thanks for your inspiring words. I appreciate it again. Thanks again. I try. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay. Please. So that concludes our official agenda. Then we would like to invite Dr. Sari to hand out souvenirs to our guests. Thank you, everyone. That concludes our agenda for today. Have a good day. Group photo.